In a farmer's field near Mount Gambier, in the south of Australia, there's a hatch in the ground less than a meter wide. Walk past it, and you'd never notice. Beneath it, a shaft plunges into a flooded chamber as long as a football field, filled with crystal clear, fresh water. They call it the shaft. On the 28th of May, 1973, 8 young scuba divers went down into it. Only 4 came back up. What turned a quiet club dive into the worst cave diving disaster in Australian history? And why couldn't experienced ocean divers find the way out that was right above their heads? From the outside, the shaft doesn't look like a place that kills. In the middle of a pasture, there's a small opening in a slab of limestone, roughly a meter across. Cattle wander past it without a care, and anyone who doesn't know better could walk right by and notice nothing at all. But behind the modest hole lies another world. The shaft drops straight down, the walls squeezing in around the diver at first, then suddenly falling away. The opening blooms into a vast underground chamber, about 140 meters long and 80 meters wide, completely filled with water. And this water is unusual. It has seeped down through the thickness of the limestone and been filtered until it's almost distilled in its clarity. Underwater visibility reaches tens of meters. A diver hangs weightless inside an enormous cathedral of stone, where the beam of a torch trails off into blue and meets nothing to stop it. That beauty was exactly what made the place so tempting, and that same beauty was a lie. The narrow entrance gave no hint of the scale of the abyss below. A person would squeeze through an opening the size of a manhole cover and suddenly hang above a void with no familiar floor beneath and no familiar ceiling above the water. The shaft looked like a wonder of nature, and it invited you in. Nothing on the surface warned that finding the way back out would be so hard. On the 28th of May, 1973, a group of young people pulled up to that hatch in the field with their scuba gear, certain that all that lay ahead was one more beautiful dive. To understand how 8 people ended up at that hole, you have to go back to what Australia was like in the early 70s. Scuba diving was going through a genuine boom. Gear had become more affordable. Dive clubs were springing up all along the coast, and thousands of young people were discovering the underwater world. Most of them dived in the ocean, along the reefs, over shipwrecks, out in open water where the sky was always overhead, and the way up was a straight line. The Mount Gambier region was a revelation for that generation. Here, in the karst country, rain had been trickling through the limestone for centuries, filling the underground hollows with water of incredible purity. The freshwater sinkholes offered visibility that divers in the murky coastal sea could only dream of. Rumors of clear, flooded chambers spread through the clubs, and divers began heading inland. The trouble was that almost nobody drew a line between 2 completely different kinds of diving. In the sea, if something went wrong, a diver rose straight up and broke the surface. In a flooded cave, there was a stone ceiling overhead. There was no direct route up. The only exit was where you'd come in, sometimes 100 meters off to the side. There was no mandatory certification back then, no strict rules for places like this. Only a handful of people gave any thought to the treachery of nitrogen narcosis at depth, or to how instantly silt stirred up off the bottom turns crystal water into an impenetrable wall. People arrived with ocean experience and ocean habits, and they figured that was enough. That day in May began like any other. Around 1:30, a group of 9 gathered at the shaft. 8 of them were getting ready to go under. The 9th, Joan Harper, was staying up top with the supplies and gear, the link to the surface. Among the divers were people who knew each other from the club and from diving together. 2 of them were brother and sister, 22-year-old Stephen Millett and his 19-year-old sister, Christine. Glenn Millett was from the same family. Nearby was 28-year-old Gordon Roberts, along with John Bockerman, Peter Burr, Larry Reynolds, and Robert Smith. Young, healthy, passionate people for whom a dive was a joy, not work at the edge of survival. None of them thought about death that morning. The shaft drew them in precisely because it seemed so safe. Water sheltered from waves and currents, a steady temperature, fantastic visibility. It looked far calmer than the open sea. Only later would it become clear how deceptive that sense of peace really was. Of the 8 who went under, 4 would never return: Stephen, Christine, Gordon, and John. A year on, their names would appear in official reports and change the rules for an entire community of divers. But for now, they were simply checking their gear at a hatch in a farmer's field, agreeing on a plan, and taking turns getting ready to drop into the narrow shaft, beyond which a huge flooded chamber opened up. The dive began right at the throat of the shaft. To get inside, the divers had to squeeze through the tight opening one at a time, and with a full set of tanks and gear, that alone took care. Past the pinch, the shaft dropped away, and after a few meters, the walls that had just been pressing in from every side suddenly parted. The torch beams no longer found anything to land on. The light just vanished into emptiness. The water level in the shaft sits about 7 meters below the surface of the ground. Below that, the flooded chamber itself began. The divers descended along the walls and saw beneath them a huge mound of rock, a ceiling that had collapsed over the millennia, a cone of rubble on the floor of the chamber. Its peak rose to about 36 meters below the water, and that was the shallowest part of the underwater cave. From that stone hill, tunnels branched off into the darkness. One ran to the northwest, another to the east, and the eastern passage dropped into an abyss as deep as 124 meters. From the surface, none of this could be read. Down below, a diver wasn't hemmed in by a tight crawl, but surrounded by a dark expanse with no clear boundaries, and working out where the exit lay was far harder than it had seemed from above. There was one detail that sets cave diving apart from every other kind. The group didn't use it. It's the guideline, a continuous rope the diver pays out from the very entrance, and that trails behind him for the whole dive. In clear water, it seems pointless. But lose your visibility, and that thin line becomes your only tie to life. Holding it in your hand, you can find your way blind back to the shaft, even in total darkness. In the shaft. On the 28th of May, there was no continuous guideline running to the surface. The divers navigated by sight, by the light, by the walls, by each other. As long as the water stayed clear, that worked. The group stayed together, each one able to see the neighboring torches and the outline of the enormous chamber. But the chamber was too big. The walls fell away by tens of meters, the reference points dissolved into the blue, and the one reliable marker, the narrow entrance, shrank to a tiny detail somewhere overhead that was easy to lose track of. Some of the divers held to a sensible depth and didn't stray far from the entry point, but 4 of them, Stephen, Christine, Gordon, and John, began to sink deeper. They were drawn farther on, toward the mouths of the tunnels, deeper into the cave, past everything they'd agreed on at the surface. Every meter down led them away from the only exit and closer to the depth where the human mind itself, under pressure, begins to work against its owner. Underwater, something happens to a diver's body and mind that never happens on land. The nitrogen we breathe, harmless at the surface, starts to affect the nervous system like an anesthetic. This state is called nitrogen narcosis. It creeps in unnoticed. A person feels a light euphoria, loses caution, and misjudges danger and time. The deeper you go, the stronger the effect. The 4 divers were sinking toward the mouths of the deep tunnels, and with every meter the pressure grew. The experience they had built up in the ocean only worked against them here. The road to air didn't lead upward, but backward, horizontally toward a distant entrance they had already lost from view. Without a guideline, the entire way back existed only in their memory and in their sense of direction. And the sense of direction is the first thing nitrogen distorts under pressure. What felt like an exciting exploration of a beautiful cave was quietly turning into movement ever farther from rescue. They didn't feel themselves crossing a line. That's the treachery of depth. The boundary between everything's under control and there's no way out is marked by nothing at all, and you cross it without a single warning. The end came from the most ordinary thing of all, the movement of fins. On the floor and the rocks of a flooded cave lies the finest layer of sediment, built up over millennia. One careless kick near the bottom is enough to lift it into the water, and then comes what divers call a silt-out. In a matter of seconds, the crystal-clear water turns into an impenetrable brown cloud. The torch beam no longer cuts through the murk. It bogs down in it, reflects straight back into your face, and only blinds you. Visibility drops almost to zero. For someone holding the guideline, this is unpleasant but not fatal. He feels for the rope and follows it out. For those without a line, a silt-out is a death sentence. In an instant, every reference point is gone. Floor, walls, and ceiling merge into one solid darkness. Even the sense of which way is up and which is down disappears. Underwater, without light and without anything to hold, The body stops feeling direction at all. The four divers found themselves in that cloud at great depth, poisoned by nitrogen, with no rope leading home. Every stroke they made trying to find the way out kicked up a fresh cloud of silt and made the water even more impenetrable. Panic and nitrogen narcosis began to work together, driving them toward hasty, desperate movements, exactly the kind that are most dangerous in a situation like this. The instinct that saves you in the sea became a trap here. When a person underwater loses their bearings and starts to choke on fear, the body wants only one thing: up, to the surface, to air. Two of the four divers swam straight up, toward where, by all the logic of the ocean, the sky should be. But above them wasn't an exit. It was the roof of the cave. The ceiling of the shaft isn't flat. It has hollows, domes, stone pockets that lead upward and end in dead ends. Rising, a diver would push his head into one of those domes. The roof deceived him. It climbed upward like a real way out, and for a second it might have seemed like salvation. But there was no air there, only stone and murky water trapped beneath the vault. Up no longer meant anything. The one true path to air lay off to the side and downward, toward the distant shaft, not toward the deceptive dome overhead. While two of them tried to find a way out through that stone pocket, the others searched in the murky water and couldn't feel for the point they'd entered through. The huge chamber that had seemed so clear and easy to read from above had turned into a dark maze without a single sign. Each of them had only the air left in their tanks, and that supply was draining away without mercy. After that, it all came down to the cold arithmetic of air. A person underwater has exactly as much time as their supply of breathing gas allows. At great depth, air is used up faster, and fear and exertion speed the breathing faster still. The four divers had nowhere to draw a new supply and nowhere to surface. Without a guideline, in murky water, poisoned by nitrogen, they couldn't find the way to the shaft while they still had air. Stephen, Christine, Gordon, and John died underwater in that cave. 4 young lives cut short in a single dive. The exact sequence of their final minutes can never be reconstructed, and guesswork has no place here. There were no witnesses, and the darkness and murk left no picture behind. All that's known is what's been confirmed. They did not come out. What began as a quiet club outing to a beautiful sinkhole became the worst disaster in the history of Australian cave diving. And the bitterest part is how ordinary the causes were. No storm, no collapse, no equipment failure. They simply didn't pay out a rope, went a little deeper than they should have, and stirred a cloud of silt off the bottom. Up above, at the hatch in the field, the 4 surviving divers were still waiting, staring into the dark opening from which their friends were supposed to appear. On the surface, time passed altogether differently. Those who had stayed at shallow depth had climbed out long ago, back into an ordinary day in May, to the grass and the sky. And at first, no one was frightened by the absence of the rest. Divers linger underwater. Everyone has their own pace. But the minutes went by, and no one appeared from the opening. Little by little, up top, they began to run a simple and terrible calculation. A scuba diver's air supply is limited and well known. When more time had passed than any tank could last, it became clear. The 4 underwater could no longer breathe. They couldn't surface late. They couldn't wait it out at depth. Their air was gone. Joan Harper, who'd stood watch up top the whole time, and the surviving divers raised the alarm. Police and rescuers were called to the shaft. The quiet farmer's field became the scene of an emergency. People who that same morning had been laughing and checking gear together now stood at a tiny hatch and understood that 4 of their friends and loved ones were gone, and that the bodies remained somewhere down there, in the dark chamber, tens of meters deep. The realization of so many deaths in a single dive didn't sink in all at once. But by evening, there was no doubt left. The shaft had taken 4, and they would have to be brought back from underwater, from the very cave that had proved fatal to experienced but unprepared people. The rescue operation ran into the same wall that had killed the divers. As early as the 29th and 30th of May, police divers went down into the shaft. But what an ordinary underwater team could manage in a harbor or off a pier turned out to be beyond reach here. The depth ran far past the marks that are safe for standard equipment. The cold water, the total darkness beyond the narrow cone of light, the maze of tunnels, and that same silt rising with every movement made the search extremely dangerous. To descend into a cave like that without special training meant adding new victims to the ones already lost. In those first days, the bodies couldn't be found. It became obvious that ordinary methods wouldn't bring them up, that what was needed were people trained to work in flooded caves specifically and equipment rated for great depths. The scale of the tragedy immediately reached beyond a single dive club. The day after the deaths, on the 29th of May, the authorities announced a government inquiry into what had happened. The loss of 4 young people in one dive shook the country and forced an uncomfortable question. How had a deadly place been left open to free access, while people with purely ocean experience descended into an underwater maze with no oversight whatsoever? On the surface, there was no answer yet, and underwater, in the dark chamber, a long and grim task still lay ahead: the recovery of the bodies, work that would stretch on for nearly a year. The bodies were brought up one at a time, with long gaps between expeditions. The first, on the 23rd of January, 1974, was Stephen Millett. His body was found relatively shallow, about 15 meters below the water's surface, and recovered by police divers. The others lay much deeper, in a zone ordinary rescuers couldn't reach. That part of the work was taken on by a specialized team led by R.G. Traynor, experienced cave divers capable of working at great depth. On the 11th of March, 1974, they brought up 2 at once, Christine Millott and Gordon Roberts, from a depth of about 60 meters. The last, on the 9th of April, 1974, was John Bockerman, whose body lay deeper still, at roughly 65 meters. By then, he had been underwater for almost 11 months. Each of these recoveries was a separate, dangerous expedition. The work had to be done in total darkness, at depths where nitrogen narcosis and the risk of decompression are constant companions, lifting a body up through narrow tunnels to the distant shaft. One wrong move, and the rescuers would have joined the cave's list of victims. That all 4 could be returned to their families was made possible only by people who had mastered cave diving, the very discipline whose absence had killed the group. Out of the tragedy, an entire system of rules was born. The deaths of 4 in the shaft, together with other deaths in the Mount Gambier sinkholes, shook the whole community. As early as September 1973, just months after the disaster, the Cave Divers Association of Australia, the CDAA, was formed. Its purpose was straightforward: to close off free access to deadly flooded caves and to let in only those who had proved their training. For the first time, diving in places like this required mandatory certification. In 1974, the association launched a system for testing divers, and later, in 1989, it replaced that with a 3-tier training system, where each level opened access to harder and deeper dives. In those same years, the underwater search unit of the South Australian Police was growing, and for them, the shaft was a brutal lesson. The rules that seem obvious today were, in large part, written at the cost of that group in 1973. A continuous guideline from the very entrance, strict depth limits, an air supply with a mandatory reserve for the way out, training to work in conditions of total loss of visibility. Everything the 8 divers lacked that day in May became a mandatory law of the environment. People who descended into the shaft with nothing but ocean experience unwittingly showed the whole country where the line runs between open water and an underwater cave, and how dearly it costs to ignore it. Half a century has passed, and the little hatch in the farmer's field is still there. The shaft still exists, and the water in it is just as clear and beautiful as ever. But now, only a certified cave diver can go down there, someone who's completed the training, knows the rules, and understands what lies behind a meter-wide hole in the limestone. The opening itself has stayed the same, a modest hole in the ground that's easy to walk right past. And that's the whole lesson. The narrowness of the entrance says nothing about the depth of the abyss beyond it. A place that looks safer than the open sea turned out to be one of the most treacherous on the continent because it deceived you with its beauty and its calm. The clear water created the illusion that you could see everything and couldn't possibly get lost, right up until the moment one movement of the fins raised an impenetrable murk off the bottom. 4 names, Stephen and Christine Millott, Gordon Roberts, and John Bockerman, are forever bound to this cave. Their deaths on a single day in May forced a whole community to rewrite its rules and to treat flooded caves with the respect they demand. Today, every mandatory gear check, every guideline paid out from the entrance, every strict depth limit is, in essence, a memory of 4 young divers who entered a beautiful flooded chamber and couldn't find the way back to the tiny hatch that had let them in.